Um, I'm delighted to introduce Emma Fotheringham, who's Principal Teacher of Guidance and Teacher of Biology at Kirkcaldy High School, and Ross Patterson, who's the Developing Young Workforce Coordinator and Teacher of Modern Studies, also at Kirkcaldy High, and Rachel Barkley, who is an S6 pupil at Kirkcaldy. This session came about because at about Christmas, myself and colleagues were thinking at Abertay how we were going to support students who would come to Abertay in September. And we realized that we really didn't have any understanding about what was going in schools. Some of us had, children of school age who were coming up to S6. So we had some idea of what was happening, but we really didn't have much of an idea of the broader piece of what was happening. So I got into contact with Emma, who is a former student of ours, and I knew was teaching biology at Kirkcaldy, and very kindly she and Ross agreed to come along and do a session for us at Abertay, and Rachel came along as well to give a student's view. And that was extremely valuable and very insightful, but that was the situation in February. So clearly things have moved on significantly from February, and very kindly they've agreed to come and give the session with an update and to give us an insight into what's been going on in schools over this year, and particularly the issues around assessments and how they've been managed within schools. So I'll just hand the floor over to Emma, Ross and Rachel.
Hi everybody, it's really nice to see you all today. It's really exciting that we've got so many people signed up today, and it's great for us to know that there's so many people who are keen to make sure that we can support these young people as best as we can as they transition from school into, as Rachel said earlier, the big bad world. So as Janet said, my name's Emma Fotheringham. I'm a former student at Abertay. Janet was actually my honours project supervisor. I'm a biology teacher, and I am also principal teacher of guidance in the school. And I'll tell you a little bit about what that entails later on in the presentation. I'm going to introduce you to Ross Patterson, who is our school's Developing the Young Workforce Coordinator and also a teacher of modern studies. And later on, we're going to hear from Rachel, who's one of our current S6. So I'll pass on to Ross just now, and you'll hear from us later.
Okay, hi everybody. So just I won't read the agenda out, but we're going to kind of go over, I suppose, a little bit of an overview of what's been happening in high schools over the past year from the perspective of myself as a teacher, a class teacher, our colleagues in the school, speaking to parents, carers, and also young people themselves. As you can probably imagine, it's been a very, very strange year. We were in school, then we were in lockdown, and then we were out of lockdown, then back in lockdown, and then out again. So it was a very strange time. And hopefully this session will allow us to shed a little bit of light on some of the challenges that we've experienced over the past year, but also some of the opportunities and the positives that have come out of the past 12 months, and hopefully give you as colleagues a little bit of an insight into what experiences the young people that you're going to be welcoming in August and September into your institutions have gone through in the past year. Next slide, please, Emma. So Kirkcaldy High School, just a little bit of background to the school. It's a non-denominational comprehensive school in Kirkcaldy in Fife. We have around 1,400 pupils with a rising school roll. It's a very mixed catchment area. We have areas of the catchment area which have quite a lot of affluence and wealth. However, we also have some of the highest areas of deprivation in the country. We have low Scottish index of multiple deprivation levels, or low SIMD areas. So many of our young people and their families live in these deprived postcodes. We are also a gold rights respecting school, where pupil voice is at the heart of everything that we do. And we try to have a real inclusive approach within the school. We focus on rights of pupils, equalities, LGBTQ+ in particular. So we try to be a very, very inclusive school. So first thing I want to talk to you about, I suppose, is the digital equity aspect. Now, as I mentioned before, our catchment area is very mixed. So that was always going to be a challenge moving into lockdown. I suppose in the first lockdown back in March a year ago, but then the most recent lockdown between Christmas to April. Now, the two kind of top bullet points there, for some of our families and young people, they did have a real issue around accessing good quality devices in many households. Many households had lack of internet access, and that was a real barrier to them engaging in online learning. And as I imagine, if many people on the call, on the session will know, if you have young children who are either at primary school or high school age, trying to combine one or two more children doing home learning, if mum or dad or parents or carers are at home trying to work on laptops or sharing one device, was really, really challenging for a lot of our families. To try and get around that, the school provided 81 Chromebooks and 15 laptops, as well as 5 Wi-Fi dongles. We also had 4 laptops donated very generously by parents as well. But despite this, we still had a further 45 families who were left without enough devices to assist in their home learning, which was an issue. Now, to try and get around that for next session, and we hope we don't need this, but we have ordered a further 217 Chromebooks, just in case we have further periods of home learning. We don't want any family to be struggling or missing out in terms of engagement. That had an issue. The digital equity was an issue for some of our young people. We found that in terms of engagement, if I give you an example of a particular class, and this was replicated across the school, you may have had a return rate or a hand-in rate from pupils in terms of work being handed back at around 20 to 30%. So in every average week, you might have 30% of pupils completing the work that was set by their teachers. Now, some pupils, especially those in more maybe affluent backgrounds, thrived in lockdown learning. They were able to focus, they had structure, they had an environment and the equipment, the devices for them to flourish. For a lot of our young learners, though, they really struggled. And that was evident just by the return rates of work that came back to us as class teachers. So in the next slide, I'm going to talk a little bit about engagement. Just before we move on, though, for our colleagues in further and higher education, just I suppose to be aware, and I'm sure you already are, but for some of the young people perhaps coming to your institutions from the most deprived backgrounds, they might need a little bit extra digital support in their transition to further or higher education, especially if their families perhaps don't have multiple devices, and if there is going to be a period of, say, online seminars and lectures, especially for the first semester, just something to be aware of and something we found quite stark throughout the 2 periods of lockdown throughout the last year. Next slide, please, Emma. In terms of how the home learning period what worked and what we kind of found the main takeaways from it, many people struggled to engage with learning at home, and this was for a variety of reasons. I think we would all admit that our own motivation as adults fluctuated up and down from day to day, week to week. So for a 12-year-old, 13-year-old, it's very, very difficult. They really struggled with the lack of structure. Some didn't have the support from parents if parents were out working, for example. And then obviously you have the technical issues around internet access, devices. And I think it's, I suppose, a stereotype that all young people are very IT literate. That's not always the case. We had many young people struggling to access Microsoft Teams or Zoom or how to upload assignments. So that IT literacy we discovered was a real gap, and that was something that we recognised we had to put in a little bit of support, and was something we would have to look at to improve if we had to go through periods of lockdown learning again. To try and get around the lack of engagement and to try and provide support, staff would speak to pupils every day through emails, drop-in sessions, live lessons, pre-recorded lessons. Parents would contact staff. We tried to have a two-way communication at all times with our young people and their parents. And we really were conscious that we did not want to blame parents or young people for this lack of engagement. It was a difficult period enough, and I'm sure we can all remember back to December, January, February, without putting the blame on parents and making them feel bad about not completing every single piece of work that was set. So we tried to take a supportive approach. We would provide supportive phone calls home, maybe provide paper copies of work rather than digital assignments that were set, extra devices, etc. So we tried to take a more positive and proactive approach to support families. The impact when they came back from effectively 3 months though of sitting in the house trying to study or do their assessments in their bedroom or at their kitchen table meant that when they did come back to school, many of our young people struggled to re-engage with the school system and re-engage in school learning. They were asked to very quickly go from having no structure or routine back into the structure of the school day, the demands and expectations of teachers, the pressures of school, especially for our senior phase pupils who came back almost immediately into assessments. We as a staff and as a school tried to re-establish expectations. We developed a mental health toolkit as well. And where pupils needed additional support, we put interventions in through our guidance team and through our pupil support officers, which Emma will talk about later on in more detail. Because we've, over the last few months, we have noticed a kind of increase in pupils, perhaps their attendance maybe slipping a little bit, deadlines being missed. So it's worth noting as well, again, if as our young people, this cohort of young people come to your institutions in August and September, just I would say maybe reiterate the importance of whether it's attending lectures or tutorials, meeting deadlines, completing work on time. Just because of the nature of the last few months, some of those skills and those demands have slipped. So again, when you will have those expectations, it's maybe worth just reiterating that to them when they come to you next term. So the next thing I want to talk about is the alternative certification model, or ACM as it was known. So some of you will be aware of this. Maybe colleagues south of the border might not be as aware, but the alternative certification model was basically put in place to replace the exams that were cancelled for 2021. And the way it worked was, it was basically based on teacher evidence of pupil attainment. So when we came back from the lockdown around April time, staff and colleagues across the country and pupils were asked to gather as much evidence of pupil attainment and pupil work as possible to arrive at a grade. Previously, last year, if we remember, we went into lockdown really quickly, so there was no time to prepare. So last year's grades were effectively teacher estimates. The difference this year was that we had a period of time, albeit a very tight period of time, and I'm sure you'll have questions around this at the end, to gather evidence effectively in a 2-month period, a really, really tight 2-month period, to show what our young people could do and to try and give them the best opportunity to achieve that grade. And we'll go into that in a little bit more detail, I imagine, when you have questions at the end. But what we did was, despite the model being quite flexible, we tried to have as much consistency across the school as possible. So the way, just to give you a bit more broader insight to how it worked, schools approached it slightly differently. Now, the SQA produced a 2020 past a paper, an exam paper, which most schools opted to use for each subject. However, some schools decided to chunk that down into 1, 2, 3, maybe more smaller assessments, and others decided to combine the 2020 paper with previous past papers of previous years. The flexibility was good in a way, because it meant if pupils were off isolating with COVID or they had missed large periods of school, that flexibility allowed staff in individual departments, individual schools, to provide the best opportunity for that young person to show what they could do. The downside, however, was because of that flexibility, it meant that there was never going to be a uniform approach across every school in Scotland and every region. But where possible, we tried to make it as consistent as we could. So we had a lot of internal moderation within our own school, cross-marking between staff. We partnered with 2 or 3 cluster schools in our region to, again, cross-mark, talk about the standards of marking. We would swap papers and have discussions with colleagues around standards. We had subject network meetings, and we had SQA experienced teaching staff who marked for the SQA, supporting more inexperienced colleagues who perhaps have not went through that process before. We also had inset days put aside for moderation as well as understanding standards. We did gather the evidence under strict exam conditions to ensure the validity. Now, obviously, they were not exams in the same sense of the word. Some pupils would call them exams, others were calling them assessments or tests, or we can get into that, I suppose, at the end as well. But in order to have that consistency, we did have to assess pupils under exam conditions. So no mobile phones, no notes, timed, silence, etc. That was how we approached it in every subject. Additionally to that, we have pupils who have assessment arrangements, who maybe have additional support needs, or maybe have needs such as they have dyslexia or dyscalculia. Now, this has a big impact and has had a big impact over the last few months on our pupils, because whereas in the past they might have had one exam for each subject, they may now have 3 to 5 tests, assessments instead of the one, which means they are getting assessed numerous times. And also means as a staff and as a school, it was a huge logistical operation trying to coordinate additional arrangements to be supervised for each pupil across the school over a really tight time period. Additionally to that, we had a lot of people, and Emma will talk about the mental health side shortly, but we have pupils who were off isolating with COVID, who were positive with COVID. Their family members were positive, they had to self-isolate. We had people just off with illness, which was no fault of their own. And also a lot of young people, off with stress, anxiety, various mental health issues that were meaning they were staying off school for periods of time. What that meant was, for us as staff, is assessments had to be rearranged multiple times. We wanted each student to have the same opportunity to show what they could do. But again, that meant that it was a difficult process to manage in terms of the tight timescale. There is an appeals process this year. Pupils can appeal if they're unhappy with their grade. That's on the SQA website. There is a process for that. We, throughout the process, tried to make it as transparent as possible for all of our learners. We, at each stage, if they had an assessment, we would provide them with their grades, with feedback. We tried to make it very clear how they were being assessed and how they could improve for their next assessment. And we tried to make sure there was no surprises. So all of our young people know what grades they have for each subject. And we would anticipate, hopefully, that will mean there won't be too many appeals. There may be some, people still may have the right to appeal that, but the evidence we have gathered over a period of the last few months should hopefully mean that the young person is happy with how we've approached that. The TikTok scandal, now some people might be laughing and they know what this is about. This was a scenario where the 2020 paper was effectively shared between pupils who had already used it in the previous weeks. So for example, if a pupil sat part 1 of the 2020 paper in week 2, and then they decided to tell their friends what questions they were using, and that particular friend went to a different school that was using it in week 4, they had 2 weeks effectively to study for that question. Now, again, that's not very equal or fair, and it disadvantages some students and advantages others. So that was an issue. And again, I'm sure we'll have questions around, could we have avoided that, or what could we have done differently? Additionally to that, we also had situations where some pupils, through no fault of their own, were absent through illness, but they had to come back then and would resit the same assessment. They would also know what that assessment would be roughly from speaking to their friends. So they would gain an unfair advantage with potentially extra days of studying time. And also there is going to be situations where you have pupils perhaps deciding to stay off, so they could have an extra few days or a week where they might know the question again and would come back and perform slightly better. This is no one's fault in a sense. This was always going to be a byproduct of the system. But I'd be interested to hear people's thoughts as we talk about that. And again, obviously we'd heard in the last day or two, there are discussions around what assessment models schools use moving forward. Do we scrap exams completely? Do we change the weighting on our exams and move to a model of continuous assessment? We know that the SQA in Scotland is being disbanded and going to be replaced, so we wait to see what's happening with that. But the ACM, I'm sure myself and Emma will be able to take more questions on it, but that's an overview of what it is and what we've kind of been doing in the past 8 weeks within school. So next slide, please, Emma. And just lastly, to finish from my side, there has been positive impacts. Now, I know I've been talking a little bit about the challenges, and it's something I wanted to make clear that it has been a very challenging year. There is no getting away from that within schools. We have had a very tough time as a profession, staff, but the young people have had such a difficult time. However, they have had some positives, and I think there will be benefits that will last long term for them, and I think will benefit them moving into further and higher education. They are definitely more digitally aware, so they now know how to use platforms such as Sway, Teams, Zoom very comfortably now, which will give them an advantage when they move into college or university. Because of the lockdown periods, they were forced to become more self-reliant as well. This independent style of learning, where they were maybe set a piece of work, they had to go and complete it, they had to submit it, there was maybe online tutorial sessions with their teacher, that kind of replicates a little bit more closely what college and university learning is like. So those pupils will have an advantage compared to previous cohorts of learners. So that is a definite advantage for them as well. I mentioned that some pupils obviously struggled to meet those deadlines, but for some, they absolutely thrived. So some really improved their time management and really got to grips with working to deadlines. And that's going to stand them in good stead again when they move into higher education. But I think what a takeaway from everyone I've spoken to was there was a real appreciation for a return to in-school learning. Now, Zoom Teams is a fantastic tool, and actually what has been a positive from us as staff is we will continue to use online platforms, even if we do go back to a normal, if that exists in the coming future. But we will use Teams, we'll use platforms to engage our students, set homework, set assessments, allow questions, contacting with parents. All of the stuff we were doing in lockdown was really valuable and really useful. So we will keep a lot of that, but there is nothing that replaces or can replicate face-to-face, in-person teaching. And young people speaking to their peers, asking their teacher for support, there's nothing that can really replicate that. So we have all been delighted to come back this term and have no disruption, touch wood. It's our last day on Thursday for Kirkcaldy and Fife. So we managed to make it through this process. And I think there is a sense of achievement from everybody. We do feel that we've come through a really difficult year together as pupils and as staff. And we're obviously so proud of everybody in our school that's done so well and really worked as hard as they can. So that would be the positives I would leave on. But again, as at the end, I'm more than happy to take questions, as I realise that was quite a whistle stop of the last year. But thank you very much. I'll pass on to you, Emma.
Okay, I'm going to pass on now to Rachel Barkley, who is one of our current S6 pupils at Kirkcaldy High School. Now, to pick up on what Mr. Patterson or Ross has just said, Rachel is one of our young people who has absolutely thrived this year. She has worked really hard. I'm Rachel's guidance teacher, and this year we've worked through her UCAS application, and she received offers from a few different universities for her application to study PE teaching. And we're delighted to say that Rachel has met her conditions. So Rachel's off to study physical education at Edinburgh University in September. So she's a real success story of Kirkcaldy High School. So I'm going to pass on to you, Rachel, to talk about what you have experienced this year.
Thank you. Hiya. So my 6th year started off where we just came out of the first lockdown, so it was a bit on edge because we came back not knowing what to expect with exams being on, and we were wearing masks in classrooms, social distancing, so it was all up in the air and what to expect. So first off, my year wasn't the same as normal. We came in, everyone was very different. We didn't get to experience some of the things you would normally get to experience. So, yeah, so next slide, please. So basically, we had no face-to-face learning with our teachers after Boxing Day, so we had to teach ourselves pretty much what we would get in an exam. We didn't know what was happening with exams, so we were stuck at home with a computer, teaching ourselves, not knowing what was happening with anything. So it made a significant impact on our education, as there was no face-to-face learning and we were given coursework to do at home. Can I have the next slide? So in the last webinar that we done, I spoke about the experience that I felt with online learning. So online learning is a skill that we had to develop very, very quickly. It was a skill that we had never have thought of that we'd have to experience before. And it had both positives and negatives. So positives is we're going to university, and it's the opportunity to learn what university feels like, as we're having to be independent and take responsibilities for our own learning to achieve the end goal. The negative is it's very new to us and we all found it different to find an appropriate schedule to how we feel and to when to take breaks. Can I have the next slide? So assessments were cancelled and we had to complete assessments. So we say that we were assessments, but they felt like really exams to us because we were under a lot of pressure. As simple as that sounds, we were all stressed, we had conditions to meet for university, and we had to complete numerous assessments for each subject over a month or two. So it was all on the go. We didn't know what was happening, what to expect. So I felt more pressure and stress from these assessments, as each day was an assessment for a different subject, with sometimes having one or two on the same day. So it was all the time, study, 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 no breaks, and I had very high conditions to meet. So I was stuck at home worrying if I'm going to meet these assessments, these conditions, and studying really, really hard. So we all felt very nervous about what to expect, because it's not going into an exam hall and sitting one exam. It's sitting a lot of them at the same time over a month or two, and it just felt like never-ending exams. Thank you.
Well done, Rachel. That was great. Thank you so much. So I'm going to just go through now a little bit of the support perspective on what's been happening since we went into lockdown in March 2020. So just to give a little bit of background as to my role in the school, I'm a guidance teacher and I started in my role in the guidance team at Kirkcaldy High School in August 2020. So my first year as a guidance teacher has been filled with a lot of unique experiences, and it has certainly been an experience. So the first thing that I want to talk about is support for learning and assessment arrangements. So as part of the guidance team, we are paired up as a faculty with the support for learning department in the school. And the reason for that is because as named person for the young people that we coordinate, we need to make sure that we coordinate any support which is required for them and make sure that parents are contacted, communications there, and make sure that the pupils are at the centre of all decisions, make sure that they've got as much support as they can have, and remove barriers to learning. So this academic year, we began the year thinking that everything was going to be as normal as possible. And so the standard assessment arrangement protocols were followed. The standard assessment arrangement procedures in the school are that we would assess pupils. So the first assessment that they would come to in the year for their subject, they would sit that assessment in class, and then usually as quickly after that as possible, they would sit that assessment with the support that they are entitled to, or support that is felt that they need in order to remove barriers. So the types of difficulties that pupils might face, which would mean that they require assessment arrangements, would be things like dyslexia, dyscalculia, ADHD, autism, but also more mental health side of things like anxiety. Pupils are eligible for assessment arrangements for anxiety as well. Pupils are then eligible for a variety of different assessment arrangements, depending on the level of need, but also depending on the subject. So they might be entitled to a reader or scribe, they might have access to IT, they might use an alternative venue, particularly for pupils who suffer from anxiety, or also for pupils who suffer from conditions like epilepsy, or they might have eligibility for extra time. And again, just to kind of take you through the normal procedures, they would sit the assessment in class, sit it with that procedure in place. If there was a significant difference in their result from that assessment, then that's them thumbs up for that assessment arrangement, and they would have that in place for their final exam or for their prelims. So usually the deadline for that is before Christmas. So we did meet that deadline in most subjects and for most pupils. So the assessment arrangements were in place. As you can imagine, between January and March, when we returned back to school, things changed. Obviously, the level of support that's required for pupils is on a moving scale, and it's important to remember that the young people have gone through something that's really traumatic, so their state of mind might change, their level of need might change. So when coming back from lockdown to all these assessments that they were going to have to sit, the need for assessment arrangements in the school increased massively. It actually turned into an almost impractical thing to arrange. The Support for Learning department did an amazing job and arranged hundreds and hundreds of assessment arrangements for pupils who, if you imagine, they have in third and fourth year, they have 7 subjects each. If they have an assessment arrangement for each of those subjects, and as Ross said earlier, they might have 3 to 5 assessments per subject, it's a huge volume of assessment material, which turned into a massive undertaking by the Support for Learning department. So that is something that we found in the school to be a huge challenge this year. And it is something going forward, when these pupils transition into college and university, it's something that these pupils are still going to require support for. So when pupils transition to college, the guidance team usually submits what's called a transition form. And with that transition form, if the pupil has a Support for Learning profile where an assessment arrangement is identified, that would be passed on to the college. This isn't something that we usually pass on to universities, but we as a school, and after discussions with the Supported Learning department, we felt that that's something that could be tightened up and it could be streamlined. It's something that we as a school could very easily pass on to universities, and it might allow for better planning. So that's one of the big themes in support that we experienced. As Ross mentioned earlier, the other huge theme that we have experienced this year in guidance is mental health and well-being. Our young people, a very large number of our young people have struggled with their mental health since returning to school, and since starting back to this academic year in August 2020. A huge proportion of our time spent in the guidance team is spent supporting pupils' mental health. The guidance team at Kirkcaldy High School is structured so there are 6 of us. There's 2 guidance teachers per house, and each of us has a caseload of over 200 pupils to coordinate support for. And a large number of us experienced really quite traumatic conversations with pupils about mental health. We had large numbers of pupils this year experiencing anxiety, low mood, depression, and very sadly, we did have a larger number of pupils than usual experiencing suicidal thoughts. And that's something that In terms of staff wellbeing, that takes a huge toll on staff, but the fact that it was something that was a marked increase compared to previous years just shows the impact that the pandemic has had on the mental health of young people. I will tell you a little bit about the structure of the support that we're able to put in place and the kind of procedures that we follow. But just in general, in order to support mental health, one of the biggest things that we do is refer our young people for counselling. We use an organisation called DAPL in school for mental health counselling, and the waiting lists for counselling from DAPL were enormous. I was submitting DAPL referral forms at least weekly at the beginning of the pandemic, at the beginning of the academic year, and that counselling is still to this day taking place over Microsoft Teams. You can imagine that receiving counselling in that way might be of benefit to some. If you're the type of person who is quite anxious meeting new people, then doing it sort of without that face-to-face interaction might make it easier. But for some, discussing traumatic experiences in your life over what is quite a cold medium is quite difficult. It also means that once the counselling session is over, it's quite a cold way of ending the session. So you're literally just sort of closing that laptop and walking away to your next class. So that is something we've found tricky. And we've also found it's been really difficult in terms of, as you can imagine, connection issues. Pupils are having to borrow a laptop, book a room for their counselling. So it has been quite tricky. So we're hoping that counselling will be able to take place face-to-face after the summer holidays. The reason why these pupils have been struggling with their mental health is obviously wide-ranging. But one of the main things has been that pupils have felt really overwhelmed with home learning. They've really struggled to motivate themselves, struggled to plan their time. And this is not just pupils who usually find school quite a challenge. This is some pupils who are usually quite high flyers, pupils who usually find the expectations of school quite easygoing. Home learning has been really, really tough for them. And as I mentioned earlier, I think it's really important to recognise and highlight that the pandemic has been, for some pupils, a childhood trauma. And it's something that for us as adults who have developed we can manage our emotions really well. It's been difficult, but for young people who haven't learned to manage their emotions and haven't learned how to cope with these traumatic experiences, it's something that's going to stay with them for a really long time. And I think it's really important to recognise that. They may have lost family members, like we all may have, but they also might have missed out on really massive milestones in their lives. For example, the primary 7s last year missed out on a huge part of their transition up to S1. And then our S6s have missed out on things like prom, they've missed out on they've missed out on huge milestones of a year where it would usually be full of fun events. So it is something to sort of recognise. As we mentioned earlier as well, a lot of pupils have really struggled to re-engage with school, and something we've noticed has had a massive impact on this is attendance. We've got large numbers of pupils who have been truanting from classes and really struggling again with the expectations of school. So that's something that we are really working to improve and really working to support our young people and families in a really difficult time. And just to kind of go back to the ACM, I think our pupils, especially in the senior phase, have really worried about the impact of the ACM on their qualifications. People like Rachel who have had conditions to meet, this has been a huge amount of pressure on them. And there's been a real lack of child-friendly language about this. Any announcement that's been on the news has been sort of doom and gloom. And then anything on the sort of SQA website is very much directed at teacher practitioners and really not directed at young people. So I think that's something to sort of consider. So I did say that I would tell you a little about the structure of the support from guidance. I know that there's quite a few people, I noticed in the chat at the beginning that there's quite a few people from student support on the seminar today, so that's quite good that we can sort of marry these things up. So I mentioned earlier in Fife, the guidance teacher is still classed as the named person for our young people. I know that in other local authorities, the named person was dropped, but in Fife, we are still named person, which means that we coordinate support for the young people on our caseload, and we're responsible for that support. We're the first line of contact for families, carers, parents, and we're the pupils' first line of contact as well. We monitor and support the wellbeing of our young people through the wellbeing indicators, or the Shinari indicators. If you have children at primary school, they're probably quite familiar with them, because I know that in primary schools they are really keen on pushing the wellbeing indicators, but at high school it's maybe not so obvious. But the wellbeing indicators make sure that we cover and monitor support for all aspects of a young person's well-being. So we make sure that they are safe, healthy, active, nurtured, achieving, responsible, respected and included. And the idea is that if all of those aspects of well-being are represented, then their well-being should be good. If any of those aspects fall, then it's our responsibility to put support in place for that. And the wellbeing indicators form part of the GIRFEC framework, or Getting It Right for Every Child. And in Getting It Right for Every Child, we look at 3 different levels of support. So we have universal, additional and intensive levels of support. Depending on the level of support that a child requires, then the guidance teacher will point them in the right direction for support, or coordinate support from outside agencies. But as I mentioned earlier, support that's required by young people is on a moving scale. So it might go from universal support up to intensive very quickly, or it might go to additional level of support. But sometimes it can go back down to universal again. And we're looking to always make sure that they are sort of as well as they can be, and we're monitoring them continuously. So in terms of mental health at Kirkcaldy High School, I'm just going to talk about how we support mental health in terms of the 3 different levels of support in the GIRFEC framework. So in the universal level of support for mental health, again, the named person is the main point of contact, and we're responsible for making sure early, appropriate and proportionate intervention is put in place. So we are responsible for noticing things early. That might be something that's passed on by another member of staff. It might be reported by the child, or it might be reported by the family, or it might simply just be something that the guidance teacher has noticed in the corridor, for example. Mental health is a priority in schools, and it has been since March 2017. And Kirkcaldy High School is probably a sector leading school in terms of mental health support. The mental health strategy was launched by the Scottish Government in 2017, and we have seen that as a massive priority. We have our mental health toolkit, which is currently on a site called Padlet, but it's going to be moved across onto the school website. I'll show you a little screenshot of that in a second, but the mental health toolkit is there to support mental health of our young people, but also their families. It was put in place during lockdown, and it can be accessed from home, but it's something that we're going to look to continue to use because it's a really nice little resource. We'll also regularly point our learners to the 5 ways to wellbeing. The 5 ways to wellbeing are recognised across the UK as sort of key ways of maintaining your emotional well-being. And they're regularly pointed to those through weekly PSE lessons in S1 to 4, through conversations with guidance. It might be just through their regular teachers, or it could be through things like social media. We've got quite an active Twitter presence at Kirkcaldy High, so you might see things about mental health on there. And then young people can also seek support from their GP. They can go to groups in school, and they can just speak to teachers. And as we all know, sometimes just talking about things can make it better. So this is just a little screenshot of the mental health toolkit, just to show you the type of thing that's on there. So it's just sort of pointing our young people in the direction of maybe phone lines that they might want to speak to, support in school, support at home, and we also look at the 5 ways to wellbeing as well on there. If a young person moves up to the additional level of support in the GIRFEC framework, it might be because they have an additional support need or a neurodevelopmental need in order to achieve mental well-being. So sometimes when a pupil requires additional level of support, a practitioner who has that deep level of understanding of mental health provision might be brought in. It's important to remember that although we're guidance teachers, we're not trained counsellors. We are just teachers at the end of the day who have an interest in wellbeing, and we are trained, but we're not trained to be counsellors, and we're not trained to be mental health practitioners. So sometimes it is important to bring other people in. So we might refer the pupil to primary care mental health workers, psychologists, educational psychologists, or it might be things like the school nurse that's brought in, or a family support worker. The family support service are usually referred through social work. And then at the intensive level of support for mental health, we do have a very small number of people who are at this stage, but this would be pupils who require evidence-based assessment and intervention by CAMHS. CAMHS are the Child and Adolescent Mental Health Service through the NHS, and that could be through a community-based service, or they might be an inpatient. Again, this is usually referred by the GP, but it could also be something that's referred by the named person or by a lead professional if they are at a stage where they have a lead professional and what's called a child's plan. Their social worker would probably put in the referral for CAMHS. So we're doing lots to support mental health at Kirkcaldy High School. Our young people still have virtual access to counselling, lots of sharing of resources, like I said, through Twitter, PSE, and we also have fantastic pupil support officers who work really closely with the guidance team and provide that really nurturing support that some of our pupils need. They have regular contact with their guidance teacher where appropriate, and regular contact home from the guidance teacher too. We actually have pupil mental health ambassadors who have links with the YMCA in our local community, and there's lots of extracurricular groups that our young people can attend. Things like we have a serenity garden, you can go and be in nature and go to tree craft club, there's Lego club, Dungeons and Dragons, LGBT group. So we have lots and lots of support in place for our young people. So that's us finished our input for today. I think we went a little bit over in terms of time. We're not too bad. So I think we're just going to open the floor to questions.
Yes.